So I'm recording.
All right. Okay. So I'll just give a little short welcome. Hi, everyone. It's really fun to see all of you again, even in your little squares that we're all in. So I'm Annie Buckley. I'm the director of the School of Art and Design here at SDSU. And I'm so pleased to welcome an artist, an activist, and my dear friend, Phung Huynh, who is our evening speaker in Amplify, Practicing Solidarity. I think you're all going to get a lot out of it, and I'm so glad to have you here with us, Phung. And I want to welcome all of our guests from the school and from the community. We're so glad that so many of you can join us. And of course, the amazing students of Art 104 who have been here every week. And I just want to mention that I've been really impressed and pleased with your questions. And so thank you all for your engagement with this series. And of course, I want to thank Michelle Schlecht, whose generous donation has supported this series, and we'll be having another one next semester. So we're really excited about that. So thank you, Michelle. And I think you're here this evening, so I'm glad to see you. And finally, of course, thank you to our Professor Amy Sanchez Arteaga for her amazing organization of the series, and she will introduce Phung further.
Yeah, thank you so much, Annie, for that warm welcome. Good evening, everybody. My name is Amy Sanchez Arteaga, and I'm the facilitator for Art 104, the course associated with Amplify this semester. Before we begin the lecture, as we do every week, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the Kumeyaay people whose land I find myself seated on for their continued stewardship of this land, this region, and the land that our university was built upon. I'd also like to acknowledge that Phung Huynh will be speaking to us today from the traditional homeland of the Hahamonga tribe of the Tongva people. And so we honor and we thank those communities. So our speaker tonight is Phung Huynh. And Phung Huynh is an artist who is based in Los Angeles and is an artist and educator. She has an MFA in studio art from NYU and a BFA in illustration from Art Center College of Design. Her practices in painting, illustration, and public art engage histories of migration, assimilation, hegemonic standards of beauty, and the politics of place and dislocation. Huynh's recent work crafts narratives that assert the agency of Southeast Asian communities in Southern California, utilizing quotidian items like donut boxes and license plates as canvases to reflect upon the commercial, social, and affective economies embodied by these objects. In doing so, her work confronts the complexity and nuance of migration, giving space to legacies of inherited trauma, refugee experience, and the aesthetics produced by what she has termed living along the hyphen of being Asian American. Phung Huynh's work generously models for us methodologies for experimenting with material histories that dispel monolithic descriptions of immigrant experience and instead bring into relief the subtle continuities as well as the stark differences encompassed by migrant communities and their contributions to our communities. Please join me in welcoming Phung Huynh, everybody. Yay!
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Profe. I can't top that intro. It's so nice to be here. I really wish I were there in person so I can see your faces and hear your voices and interact with you. That's the pleasure, right, of being invited. So where do I begin? I read your questions and really moved by them. So I hope today I can address your questions. And I also heard that some of you made drawings and responses, and I really would love to see those as well. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Okay. So as Professor Sanchez Arteaga mentioned, I am an LA-based artist, but I'm also a mother and an activist and an educator as well. And when asked, how does my artistic practice address and demonstrate solidarity? The best way for me to describe it is being a resistance auntie. Like that's who I am, right? And that comes from my understanding of wanting to embrace the value of social and racial justice and understanding that resistance is part of that. But also, I grew up in LA surrounded by mostly Southeast Asian and Mexican immigrants and refugees. And in that community, it's like a large family, extended family, and everybody's like an auntie, a tío, a prima, a primo, or, you know, we're all a big family. So for me, solidarity is about building family with each other and having each other's back. So I want to start by talking about my personal journey first and sharing that with you and how that informs my art practice. And a question that I get a lot, and I know some of you get this as well, is where are you from? This is a question that I get a lot, and it's a very loaded question. And when I'm asked that, I usually respond, I'm from LA, right? And then oftentimes I get this look like, no, 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 where are you really from? So I want to address that kind of question. So I am a Vietnamese refugee. I was born in Vietnam of Cambodian and Chinese descent. What you're looking at is my refugee photo at a Thai camp, and my father is holding me up. And this photo was important because it functioned as our documentation so that we can apply to resettle in the United States. These are drawings that I did of my parents, and the one on the left is of my father. He was born and raised in Cambodia, and he had to leave in 1975 because Cambodia was ravaged by war, violence. It was taken over by Pol Pot, the communist dictator, and also the Americans were dropping bombs on Cambodia because of the war in Vietnam. So my father falsified documents and hopped on his bicycle and rode his way to the border to Vietnam, where he escaped and met my mom. And my mom is of Chinese descent, born in Vietnam. Her parents left China because of Japanese occupation during World War II, and I was born in Vietnam as well. And in the 1970s, my parents decided there's no way we can survive in Vietnam. There was just no way with the war going on and the violence. So my father took a chance and got a boat and pretended to be a fisherman and took my entire family, my grandparents and cousins too, on the boat and escaped. And we landed in a refugee camp in Thailand. So what you're looking at are some photographs from that Thai refugee camp. And I just want to say that for refugees and immigrants, photographs are very valuable to us because we had to leave with the clothes on our backs. And sometimes we can't even grab photographs. So there are very few photographs of that era in my family's migration story. So these are very, very meaningful to me. So we stayed at this Thai refugee camp for 8 months. And on the left, you will see my mom. She always loved to sew. And that was a skill that was really important for us because that helped our family earn income and start our lives. At the camp, I grew real quickly, but my parents didn't have money to buy me clothes. So as you can see from the photographs, my mom took one of her clothing and cut it apart and made me some clothes. We resettled in Mount Pleasant, Michigan, and we were the first Asian family to be there. And we were sponsored by our Lutheran church. And although the church people were really supportive of us, the city was not very welcoming to us. We were reminders of a very unpopular war. We were seen as a drain to the system because we had to rely on the welfare system and church donations. And we also didn't speak the language. So my father felt, you know, there's no way we can stay here and decided to move to Los Angeles when I was about 3 years old. And I'm really grateful for that. In Los Angeles, as I mentioned, I was in a thriving community of other immigrants too, Mexican, Southeast Asian. And it was in Los Angeles where we met my grandma Nellie, who is very important to us. She mentored my mom and helped my mom, you know, get jobs in the garment industry and build her business. My grandma Nellie is second generation Mexican American. She would tell me stories of the Great Depression. And for me, it was important to hear about American history through a Latina lens. Like that was really important for me. She had to drop out of high school, grew up in East LA, and worked to support her family, and eventually had this thriving career in the garment industry. So she is very important to me. And she really encouraged me to be an artist when my parents didn't want me to be. And I would, you know, cry and she would be there for me, encouraging me like, you know what, you can do this. You can definitely be an artist. My parents didn't want me to be an artist. I mean, a lot of you who are, Asian and maybe not Asian, be a lawyer, be a doctor, like as a refugee, we've been through so much. We are not going to have you starve and suffer and be an artist. But, so after high school, I said, okay, fine, I'll go to USC. I'm a pre-med major, but I was taking all these art classes while at USC and decided I really got to give this a chance. I really got to try. Like my parents didn't go through all this for me not to at least try. So what I did was I learned illustration as a tool to help me gain income so that I can support myself as an artist and pay for tuition at NYU, where I went to grad school. So what I did was I got an illustration agent, and this agent would get me jobs, right, to make illustrations for hip hop magazines or print material. So what you're looking at is one of my illustrations that I did for the Rolling Stone magazine, and it's of Outkast, an R&B rap group from Atlanta, Georgia. So for me, when I was making these illustrations in my portfolio, I wanted to highlight people of color. I made mostly images of Black, Brown, and Asian folks. And my agent was really frustrated with me and said, you need to stop making images of ethnic people because you're not going to get enough jobs. And I felt that was horrific to hear and thought, you know what, forget it. I'm not going to do it. I can figure it out. I'm just going to continue to make work about my community and people who I feel in solidarity with. And what he was talking about, ethnic people, non-ethnic people, marginalized and centered people, that really struck me to the core. And it reminded me of this very, very important work by W.E.B. Du Bois, the book that he wrote in 1903, The Souls of Black Folk. And I just want to share this quote from that book. And he says in there, "It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder." And for me, this double consciousness really resonates because I'm constantly negotiating how people perceive me and how I perceive myself. And I came across Du Bois' work by my mentor, Charles Daly. Charles Daly was born in Brooklyn, raised in Brooklyn. He is an African-American artist and educator, but during the summer, he would ride the bus to visit his grandmother in Virginia and cross the Mason-Dixon line. So he would witness Jim Crow, segregation, and all this injustice. And he came of age in the civil rights during the 1960s. So for me, at the age of 16, as this young Southeast Asian American, to have this mentor, this brilliant, strong Black mentor, teach me about Black history and Du Bois and people of color was really impactful for me. He was also a Vietnam War vet too, right? So there's a lot of strong connections. He's like my second father. But he also told me, and this goes back to Du Bois' idea of double consciousness, he said to me, "Phung, you have to know your shit and their shit." And I knew what that meant. My shit, like my community, my history, and dominant culture for me when going to school and stuff was very Eurocentric and centered on whiteness. So I always really remember that. And what he said, along with what Du Bois said about double consciousness, rang even truer when I came across the work of Edward Said, who wrote about Orientalism. And even though the work centered on West Asian and Islamic scholarship, it really resonated with me in understanding how Asian bodies and people are othered and exoticized, right? And this idea of Oriental and Orientalism is extremely derogatory because the Orient is not a physical place. It exists in the imagination of the white colonialist. And that was very important, a very important part of me learning and becoming conscious. So all of that is important. And I wanted to share that because that informs the way I approach my artistic practice. So my early body of work was about disorientation. So riffing off of Edward Said's Orientalism and talking about cultural displacement, assimilation, and stereotype. So I just want to show you a few works from that body of work. So this is a painting called Sweet and Sour Pork from that body of work, Disorientation. And this one is a good example of that double consciousness I was talking about how other perceives me and how I perceive myself. So here you have sweet and sour pork, right? The sweet and the sour, this sort of cultural duality, but also playing off of stereotypes on Chinese bodies. So you have these little Siamese twins suckling on, a large mother pig. And it was this crazy coincidence, and I didn't plan on it, but that was the year of the golden pig, right? And so you have these Siamese pigs with like long, quote unquote, pigtails suckling on this giant pig mother. But this image of the pigtail also not only is stereotypical, but references the first Chinese laborers who were coming to the United States to build the railroads in the mid-19th century. So I want to show you some influences and research that informed that body of work, like the Siamese twins, right? We came up with that word Siamese twins from this image of this photograph of the original Siamese twins taken in 1865. Their names are Cheng and Eng Bunker. They are ethnically Chinese, but born in Thailand. But Thailand at the time in the 19th century was referred to as Siam by Westerns. So Cheng and Eng Bunker, when they were about 17 years old, an American naval officer saw them and was kind of disgusted but intrigued by their condition being conjoined at the chest. And he tricked them into following him and signing a contract so that he can take them to the West for this traveling freak show. In the painting, you notice those long pigtails. As I mentioned, they reference like the first immigrants, Chinese immigrants who came to the United States in the mid-19th century, but also they reference all of these very racist cartoons of Chinese people in the 19th century. And it also, conjures up this really racist history of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. This is the first blatantly racist legislation that barred a specific group of people from coming to the United States, right? And so you can see in these cartoons, the Chinese must go, no Chinese need apply. So a lot of this research informs my work. And this is the last painting I want to show you from that body of work, Disorientation. This is called Live Long and Prosper. And again, it riffs off of stereotypes. And in this painting, you'll see on the left side an old god. And this is the god of longevity in Chinese culture. And he usually holds a peach, and a peach in Chinese culture represents long life, but he also has this very deformed head, and I always felt like it looked kind of phallic. So in this painting, I'm shifting and complicating different perspectives of East and West. So all of that shifted me into thinking about the Asian female body, right? And how plastic surgery informs beauty standards imposed on Asian women. And a lot of this goes back to even when I was little, like my grandmother telling my mom, make sure you pinch her nose so it doesn't go flat, don't go out in the sun, you're gonna get really dark and that's not pretty. So those early childhood experiences, in addition to looking at the pressures of plastic surgery on Asian bodies, spearheaded this body of work called Pretty Hurts, in which I talk about whitewashing, body image, and how plastic surgery, complicates the way Asian females look at their own images and bodies. So I wanted to show you this billboard, and I feel like billboards are very strategic. They're placed in neighborhoods to advertise to that population and demographic. And this particular billboard was in Rosemead, which is a city in the San Gabriel Valley in LA County, where it's majority Asian, right? So here you have an advertisement for plastic surgery geared towards Asian women. And you'll see on the left is the woman pre-surgery with darker skin, smaller monolithic eyes and a wider face. And then after surgery, her skin is lighter, her eyes are bigger and blue, and her jawline has been narrow and more angular. So I just wanted to show you this because I think it's very important and how I came up with that body of work. In addition to looking at plastic surgery and advertisements, there are cosmetic tools that mimic plastic surgery. And I'm not making this up. Like usually when I show it, people think, oh my gosh, is this real? These are real, right? These are real things. This is a nose roller. So it's supposed to, by using this, it's supposed to like sharpen your nose, make the bridge taller, and make the nose not as flat, right? But what I find problematic about these products, if you look on the right side, is the use of a white model, right? So that non-white bodies who are buying this are seeing the white model and thinking, well, that's who I have to look like, right? And erasing my own racial identity to look like this. So that informed this painting that I did called Nose Sharpener. And I really like to play with language a lot. And in this, you see a woman like sharpening her nose. But in a lot of my work, I don't want to just be complacent, you know, I do want to have a little bit of resistance in it. So here she's like smoking a cigarette. You'll also notice that her foot is deformed and really small, because in this body of work, I reference Chinese feet binding, which is in a way a very early form of plastic surgery, right? And it is a way of conforming to a standard of beauty, and that is very, very small feet. And this is a 1,000-year practice in which, you know, young girls would break the bones on their feet by binding them to obtain like the smallest foot. And the ideal size is 3 inches. So the reason why I reference it is just to contrast like this old way of beauty, right? Smaller eyes, small feet, small breasts, with now like big breasts, big eyes, like big everything, right? So here, this is an advertisement that I was really drawn to because it talks about like colorism and skin bleaching, which I mentioned earlier is something that was very prominent growing up in my family and in my community. So on the left, you have skin whitening cream and you see an Asian model. And these advertisements are really strategic. And you'll notice how the divide of where the skin gets lighter and darker is very strategic, where most of the face is light, sort of indicating like that's what you want to look like. And then on the right, you have a white model advertising this whitening mud mask, again, creating the sense of self-imposed racial erasure and trying to aspire to look white. So that inspired me to make this painting, right? So here you see a beauty queen with this like really white, light porcelain skin as being ideal. But the image that I used was from a high school photo of a Korean beauty queen. So in 2016, I read an article about a beauty contest in Korea, and all the contestants looked the same because they all had plastic surgery and all tried to attain the same look, right? The big eyes, the more angular and narrow jaw, and lighter skin. And then what happened was the queen who won, her high school photo, which was pre-surgery, went viral, and that was really scandalous. So I wanted to co-opt that image and recreate that in the painting that you see here. This is in the garden that I did, part of the Pretty Hurt series. And in a lot of my work, you'll see I complicate Western and Eastern modes of art making. So you'll see the isometric perspective used in the painting that you see in Persian miniature painting or Japanese woodblock prints. But in here, as you look at the composition, your eyes start to draw to this very violent scene on the upper left, in which you see these two women, Asian women post-surgery with more tan, Barbie, plastic looking skin with augmented breasts and big blue eyes, trying to take this woman pre-surgery but with bound feet and forcing her to look like them. So a lot of the work is about this struggle in battling with different modes of beauty standards. So I've shown you not only, you know, plastic surgery, but products that mimic plastic surgery, right? This is something that I saw growing up. These are eye tapes. Eye tapes were used to shape your eye to make it look bigger by creating this double lid. So as you can see on the packaging on the left, you have a smaller monolithic eye. And on the right, by placing the eye tape, the eye magically looks wider and more beautiful. And again, look at how strategic the graphic designer is, right? There's all these stars and glitter around the bigger eye, and like the before is like, we don't want that, right? Like this is all messing with our perception about how we should look and what's desirable. And in addition to eye tape, this is so real. This is an eyelid trainer. So as you can see from the advertisement, just 5 minutes a day, you can train your eye to be bigger, right? And you can see that in the advertisement. But again, what's problematic is the model. Obviously the model doesn't need this eye trainer, but she, you know, the white, blue eye, bigger eye model is wearing it, showing you, the non-white client, to look like this. So I use all of that, and I make all different kinds of works that explore this theme. And I did a series of small drawings that were 3 by 3 inches, kind of recognizing that small size foot of bound feet, and really cathartically just started drawing. And it was kind of repulsive too at the same time, but it was a way for me to process. So on the left, you see the post-surgery, right, the double-lidded eye, and on the right, you have the surgery. It's called blepharoplasty. And in this process, an incision is made on the eye, the fatty tissue is taken out, and the eye is restitched to create that double lid and the illusion of a larger eye. And in these drawings, I really looked at like before and after pictures from plastic surgery. So in these drawings, you can see on the left is pre-surgery and on the right, post-surgery, going from small to big. But in these drawings, I wanted to exaggerate it and amplify, you know, that process. And I think something to think about is plastic surgery is really violent. It's an act of violence on your own physical body. I mean, plastic surgery really incorporates suturing, you bleed, you're cut, you bruise. And I came across this really horrific image of a woman who went through blepharoplasty, and she took a selfie. And I drew it. And I just was so drawn to the sutures and the tape, you know, and then really like it felt painful just looking at it. And to what extent do people go through to obtain this standard of beauty? And other questions that are important too is, you know, I do get critiqued for this kind of work. I've had women ask me and confront me like, well, what if I want to? That's my choice. You know, it's my agency and it's my power to make these decisions. Why can't I do that, right? So my question to that is, well, how much is it self-imposed and how much is it external society pressure on you to want to look that way? So in this drawing, this woman is performing blepharoplasty on herself. So where am I now, right? That was like really grotesque, and that was a very hard process to go through and making work about that subject. But for a lot of us, and I think we're going through it right now as we wait for elections, a lot of us, our life really changed 4 years ago. And for me, that change was also looking at racism and looking at anti-immigrant sentiment. And also with this administration, Vietnamese and Cambodian refugees were deported at the highest rates. And that spearheaded me in this new body of work about the refugee experience and resettlement, in which I talk about and try to express artistically anti-immigrant xenophobia, anti-Asian racism, which is very real right now with COVID, and again, the highest deportation rates of Cambodian and Vietnamese refugees and immigrants. So you saw my photo of myself at the Thai refugee camp, but I started this series of wanting to make work about my personal family history and also honoring those who share this history of the Vietnamese and Cambodian refugee experience on pink donut boxes. And the reason why I decided to do it on pink donut boxes is that 90% of the donut shops, as you know, I know you researched it already, are owned by Cambodian refugees and immigrants. And I started this also because one of my colleagues a few years ago gave me an LA Times article about why these donut boxes are pink. And the story is a Cambodian immigrant donut shop worker was trying to save money and called the box distributor. And at this time, the boxes were mainly white in the late 70s and 80s. And he called them, he's like, do you have anything cheaper? And the company, the box distributor said, well, we have all this pink cardboard. Red ink accidentally fell in and made all this cardboard pink. You can use it. And hence that began this whole series of, right, pink boxes that are very unique to California, right? And so that's why I started to draw that. I didn't acknowledge that. This is a drawing I did of Mr. Rogers. He is not a Cambodian Vietnamese refugee, I know. But the reason why I wanted to draw him was my family and I learned English by sitting in the living room and watching TV. And Mr. Rogers was one of them. We would watch his program and learn English. And for me, what I think is so important right now is his question, won't you be my neighbor? Right? This idea of solidarity, of boundaries, of who's in, who's out, who's legal, who's not, is a very loaded question. And I wanted to do that for this pink donut box. It's funny because one person asked, well, you kind of made him look Cambodian. I'm like, I didn't intend to do that. That just kind of happened. So I interviewed a lot of people in the Vietnamese and Cambodian community, and this is Mei Ly Thao. She's known as the Donut Princess, and her family has a donut shop in Santa Monica. And growing up, she would, do homework after school at the donut shop. She, at the age of 8, would put a milk crate and stand behind the counter and try to help customers. So I was like collecting all these stories and wanted to draw these people and honor them, right? Because a lot of immigrants don't want their kids to do the jobs that they do. They want their kids to do better. So Mei Ly Thao was very unique in that she came back to her parents' business and rebranded it and got an Instagram account and really made it blow up today, right? And so that's a very unique story. We don't hear that much. And in this series, I also wanted to deconstruct this Asian model minority stereotype. Not all of us have that American dream. Not all of us are good at math, right? Or, pull ourselves by the bootstraps and succeed. When I came to LA and grew up in the 80s and 90s, there was high gang rapes and violence. And a lot of us had to resettle in neighborhoods that were underserved, poor, and a lot of gang members. And while our parents were working and dealing with their own trauma and couldn't tell us what was going on, some of us, were vulnerable and joined gang life. And so my parents made sure that didn't happen and worked really hard and put us in all girls Catholic schools. But that wasn't true for a lot of my peers and people in my community, like Chef T. He's a kid of Cambodian refugees. They resettled in Long Beach and he entered gang life. That's just how it was. I don't judge him for it. And his sister died on her birthday, and he realized, I can't do that. And in her honor, he changed his life. He left the gang life and became a chef, which was something he always wanted to do. And to this day, he goes back and gives back to his community. So this series for me is honoring all these wonderful stories in my community, because I don't think it's talked about enough, right? This is DJ Honey. She's also a Cambodian refugee. She's queer, she's a DJ, she loves hip hop. And again, I just want to honor these very beautiful stories that are not always, that always don't have a platform. And what I love about her story is she started a nonprofit to support queer Cambodian LGBTQ plus folks. And she is married and she had this beautiful traditional Cambodian wedding. And I love that story so much. Part of that series too is remembering as a refugee and immigrant that I don't have an anglicized name. And every time I went to a gift shop or anytime I went to Magic Mountain, let's say, I could never find my name on those keychains. And some of you may experience the same thing. So I started to do a series of cross-stitched California license plate to honor that and to honor my refugee experience. And I think it's really important to distinguish between a refugee and an immigrant, in that an immigrant chooses to leave their home country, but a refugee has no choice but to leave their home country. And I think that's a very important distinction when we talk about these issues. So here you have my name. And for me, it is a very important stance and political stance not to change my name and to keep my name. And I chose to cross stitch it because my grandmothers taught me how to sew, and I'm a garment factory kid. So, immigrant labor and garment labor is something that I want to honor in this body of work. But also in this body of work, I wanted to recognize California as a very specific site in talking about refugee and immigrant experiences and conversations. Maybe some of you might remember Prop 187 was a really controversial issue in which it passed and was very anti-immigrant. And it proposed that anybody who's undocumented could not receive public services such as immunizations, education, and getting a license, right? So I think the work kind of nods at that as well. And in these, you'll see unique names. So you'll see names that are un-anglicized, but I love names that are reinvented when immigrants and refugees come and resettle and change their name, like DJ Honey, right? Switch up the spelling and make it kind of unique. I really, really love that. Okay, so where am I now? I'm all about resistance and activism in my art. And for a long time, I kind of kept that separate because I didn't know how to express my activism in my art. But I think the last 4 years really spearheaded me in doing that. So this is an early piece that does that, using like, how do I use my artistic practice to express, resistance and social activism. So this is a resistance matriarch. As I said, I'm a resistance auntie. So this is kind of like a self-portrait in a way. But the work was painted on a found painting that I felt is very, like, that gold gilded frame is so commonplace. And I wanted to put a stamp of a resistance matriarch on top of that. And the image that I use comes from a 19th century photograph of women with bound feet in China. So what was happening during this time period is you have a lot of Western photographers from America and Europe going to China, exoticizing, but also like taking pictures of these women, making them sit down and wanting to document this. Like, look at them, look at how different they are, right? And you'll see this a lot even in photographs of indigenous peoples as well, right? So in the painting, I wanted to give her power back. Like, no, I'm not going to sit for you. I'm going to resist that, So that's where the piece is inspired by this photograph. And then kind of riffing off of that, I wanted to paint a resistance virgin, kind of deconstructing this idea that, Asian women are docile and passive, because especially for Southeast Asian women, we are definitely not. And we are resistors, and we are matriarchs. I think the greatest work in activism and collaborating, where it deals with not only resistance, but fighting patriarchy and white supremacy, is my collaboration with Rocky Rivera. Some of you may have heard of her. She's a Bay Area rap artist. She's a mother, educator, and writer. She was born in the Philippines and came here when she was 4 years old. So a lot of our migration story is very similar, and our values are very aligned in that we have social justice values. We're pro Black Lives Matter, we're anti-gentrification, we're hardcore feminists. So for me, I was really inspired by her work and how she uses rap as a voice of resistance, and taking rap that is sort of conventionally seen as misogynistic and using that language and turning it around and making it a powerful female voice. And I really love that about Rocky Rivera. So one of our first collaborations was me creating a painting for her album cover. And this was really about this really dark period, the last 4 years, and really confronting and fighting white supremacy and patriarchy during this administration. And as we talked about what kind of image we wanted, I suggested, why don't we use Kali Ma, right? This great Hindu goddess, the destroyer of evil, who brings liberation, right? And we know her as this like darker skinned deity holding the head of a man. But here, I have the heads of Proud Boys. And, just recently where Trump will not denounce white supremacy, I think this is a very important image for me, especially right now. And so that's what this work is really about. So very important is this idea of practicing solidarity. I think that's the theme of this series right now, right? And solidarity, making art, is just not enough. Sometimes it can be performative. I think practicing solidarity also means really coming through for people, building community, and really being family, right? And showing up. So for me, how does that happen with art? I am an activist, I protest. I'm in an anti-racist group right now. I'm really holding my police department and my city accountable. So I feel like as an artist who really embraces solidarity, it takes more than just making art. And not only that, when you make art and you do collabs, you have to be very intentional about who you collaborate with. So for me, practicing solidarity, that work was really important with self-help graphics and art, which is this wonderful, wonderful nonprofit community-based organization in LA. It started out by Sister Karen, who was a nun, wanted to give free art classes to the community in Boyle Heights in East LA. And then it grew as this beautiful hub that supported Chicano and Chicana artists, which you didn't really have in mainstream art institutions. So I'm very proud to work with self-help graphics and to do work in solidarity with them. And one of them was addressing the detention of families at the southern border and the separation of families. So this was a silkscreen print that I did about that topic and about protesting and being in solidarity with Latinx folks, especially folks who are being incarcerated at the border. So this is about utopia and dystopia on the left. Dystopia is being separated from your family, right? And this, I use Rocky Rivera as my model. And utopia is having your family together as a unit. So that's something that I really, really felt strongly about in this work. Self-help graphics was also involved with the census. And as you know, like that was really controversial. And, Trump tried to shut that down really early. But it was important to get marginalized communities to participate in the census so that they count. So I collaborated with self-help graphics in this solidarity movement to endorse the census and to make sure that folks, immigrant communities, Latinx communities and Southeast Asian communities that are afraid to fill out the census, to encourage them, no, look, you need to fill this out so that you count, so that you matter. So please do this, right? And in my work, I don't just draw anybody. I really pick strategically people in my community. And this is my family, people that I work with. These are all people who, like me, really believe in social justice and racial justice issues. And then recently that print was put on a billboard and put in Northeast LA, again, just to encourage our community, hey, you know what, make sure you fill out that census. So as you can see from my personal story and my work, a lot of my solidarity aligns with Black and Brown communities. And this work was really, really a joy for me. I've always wanted to show in Mexico, and a curator, Lydia Espinosa, approached me and she said, look, we want to address COVID right now and talk about how to connect. So she curated a show in LA and in Mexico City, in which LA artists showed Mexico City and Mexico City artists showed in LA. And that for me is like real solidarity. So they took my mom's image that I drew of her, reproduced it and put it in Mexico City. And for me, I think that was important also in talking about like border issues and like families being separated. But I really, really loved that particular project that I was able to participate in Mexico City. A lot of the work that I showed you was from my studio practice, but I also make public art. And for me, I love public art because it's really for the people, it's not just whatever I want to do, but public art is about understanding the community I'm serving, researching that neighborhood, and making art for them. And it's free. It activates their space, right? It uplifts their neighborhood. So this was a piece that I did for the city of El Monte, which is a community that has a lot of interfacing and intersectionality with Asian and Latinx communities. So in this series, I use the image of papel picado, which is an art form used in Chinese culture as well as Mexican culture. And in this series, I wanted to honor, the Tongva and the solidarity between Mexican and Asian immigrants. And you can see that in the painting here that was used for that bus station in El Monte. And in this image, you'll see I wanted to honor, Japanese American and Mexican American farm workers. They farmed together, they worked together, they also went to war together. And a lot of this was to prove their Americanness, right? Like, I am a patriot, I have to go to war, but I wanted to show that kind of solidarity in the work. Somebody asked me about Roy Choi, and I'm like, I don't know if I want to show it, but I'm like, I have to show it, right? So for those of you who don't know Roy Choi, he grew up in LA, he's Korean American. And like me, he really identifies with, Mexican identity because we were brought up in LA, being so close to the southern border. Like, it's kind of part of our cultural identity too, growing up here in LA. And all these fancy food trucks now was really spearheaded by Roy Choi. He was influenced by taco trucks, and he thought, oh my gosh, what if I made a taco truck that integrates or fuse Korean food and Mexican food, right? So he came up with like kimchi quesadillas or bulgogi tacos. But what he was doing with food is showing their crossover, like chile and kimchi, you can be found also in Mexican food. But what I love about Roy Choi, he's a culture builder. He's not just, he doesn't just make food. He's a culture builder, and he's also an activist. And he also is an advocate for Black and Brown communities. So he asked me to paint a mural for his first restaurant in Las Vegas, and he wanted to be Los Vegas. He wanted to bring LA to Las Vegas. And I'm like, I don't paint for restaurants, but it's Roy Choi, and he's intentional, he's an activist. I'm like, okay, let's do this. And we talked about this being a love letter to LA. This mural was really about a love letter to LA. And we had this conversation, and I wanted to honor, the immigrant community of LA, of Black and Brown folks, but particularly in LA. And you'll see this fusion of where I use nopales, cacti as a resilient plant. It can be parallel to how immigrants and refugees are very resilient. You don't need a lot, but you can thrive in the harshest communities. And again, these are all people I know, folks that I know who give back to LA, but I love the research and this cultural fusion, like the rooster you can see in Loteria. You'll see the koi fish that represents, that can be found in the Echo Park Lake, and here La Virgen, of course, but with a Chinese cherub. So this was like a really fun piece for me to honor not only Tongva land, but immigrant labor. And you can see it here too. Unfortunately, with COVID, it was shut down. It was really thriving, and it was a really fun place, but hopefully we can return to that again soon. So I just want to wrap things up with where I am at now. And right now I'm doing probably the most important work I'm ever going to do. And if you haven't done so already, there's an amazing documentary called No Mas Bebés. And it's about the history of coerced sterilization at the LA County Hospital here in Los Angeles. So what happened in the 1960s and 70s was a lot of Mexican mothers who were going to deliver their babies were forced to sign paperwork in which they were sterilized, and the mothers didn't even know about it. And there were over 200 mothers who were coercedly sterilized, and all of them were either of Mexican descent or Mexican American. And it was only recently that the county of LA apologize and recognize this and apologize to the mothers, and decided also to hire an artist to recognize this terrible, shameful history and to honor the mothers. And that's where I am right now. And for me, like, this is probably the greatest moment of using art to be in solidarity. So I just want to end with that.
Wow, thank you so much. That's what a powerful place to end, Phung, and what a powerful way to also, I think, launch us into, we have really great questions, I think, that have been written by the students that think about and that point to those kinds of histories of pain. And I think several of the questions, maybe one of the overarching themes that runs through many of them is that kind of immigrant and refugee kind of shared historical pain, and the way that that has shown up in your work. So I don't know if you want to talk about that in a general way, or if it would be helpful if we should go to one of those more specific questions.
Sure. Well, I just want to say, like, it's a scary time to be an immigrant or a refugee right now. You know, I mean, for me, when my family came in the 70s, I feel that the government felt really bad about the bombings in Southeast Asia. They were more willing to help us. That was a very unusual time. That does not happen right now. I don't think it'll ever happen again. And I think, you know, and for me, I'm a community college teacher. I have DACA students. You know, I'm very aware of that and how vulnerable that is and scary that is. It's a very scary time to be an immigrant and a refugee. And for a long time, I didn't want to make work about that because I felt, why would I make work? Will it do any justice to make work about that? Or would I be commodifying this experience by making art about that? But it was only recently, within the last 4 years, and how scary it is for so many folks who are vulnerable, right, with this documentation status, that I want to make work. I want to, like, uplift them and say, look, I was there too, and I'm with you, and I'll do everything I can, you know, to support you.
Yeah, that's, I think it's such an important and timely work to be talking about. So I think one of the questions that I think could be really great to hear more around is the student. I'm going to read what the student has written. So it says, Miss Huynh, I'm also an artist that comes from a family of Viet refugees and grew up in America learning to assimilate. Did you ever feel at odds trying to express yourself and aspects of your multicultural upbringing in your work? I ask because this is something I'm personally struggling with, finding and expressing an identity when you're in the midst of so many influences.
Oh my gosh. Well, hello, fellow Viet American, and thank you for that question. You are in a very important position right now, because at least for me, my generation, we were the first major wave of Viets to come. So you have to carry on this torch and really explore what it means to be second, third, or fourth generation, you know, Viet. And yeah, absolutely. Right now, I'm kind of like, yeah, whatever. I'm going to be whatever I want to do. Da, da, da. But of course, I went through that too. I went like, oh my God, I had a list of names that I wanted to be. Should I be a Cindy or a Lisa? Or, you know, of course, you know, I mean, of course we think about those things. And it's very hard to talk about the generation before, right? But you got to find your community. You got to find people like you who are going through the same thing and talk about it and find support and do it. I mean, I really encourage you to move forward and to make work about this. You know, I think for a lot of Viets, there's not just one, right? I think it's unfair for people of color in that once you do that one thing, nobody else can. Like, that's not fair. You don't see that with white folks. You know, how many times have I seen abstract male art paintings? Like, how many? You know, really, you know? So there needs to be multiple voices. It can't just be one or two. You have to be, you need to do it as well. So yay, fight the power for you, you know?
Yeah, I wonder if maybe you could share with us some of the influences or some of the artwork that you were looking at that helped you in that path to determining your artistic voice and finding your power in your process.
Yeah, thank you for that question. As I mentioned, Mr. Daly was very pivotal for me because when I went to school, my professors were mostly white men, right? So they're going to show me white male artists. You know what I mean? And so thankfully I had Mr. Daly to offset that. And like looking at Black artists was very important for me because it showed me resistance. It showed me like, look at what these folks have been through and yet they are resilient. You know, that was really important. Um, and a lot of it is, again, knowing your shit and their shit. You know, if it's not there for you, you know, you're lucky to have Profe like Amy, right? Because I didn't have that. So if you don't have that, then you go look for it. It's out there. It's out. You're in San Diego, you know, you are, there's so many different resources. So if it's not there for you, you really got to seek it out. So for me, I had to seek that out, right? So I know she's old, like Artemisia Gentileschi was powerful for me, like seeing a woman be able to paint, like cutting off men's heads in the 17th century. Like that's badass. Like how can that not inspire me, right? Right. So that she was very important to me. Charles White, African-American artist, was really influential for me. Shasya Sikandar, Pakistani artist, was really inspiring for me. So kind of with broad strokes, artists who really inspire me, I had to seek out, but just showed me the multiplicity of what artists of color can do, that it doesn't have to perpetuate this Eurocentric white narrative. Yeah.
Yeah. That those are such powerful references, and I think for the students, I'll make sure to pull some of those names and link those in the modules in case anybody is curious about that. So moving to another question, which I think has a little bit to do with the question around beauty standards and beauty standards, particularly around women's bodies and femme bodies. One of the students asks, something I wish that I could find the right words to tell, something I wish I could find the right words for is to tell my mother how beautiful she is, especially because she does not exemplify classic Western beauty standards. What, if anything, would you advise me to tell her? And what piece of your work do you feel most proud of regarding feminine beauty? And I think a kind of follow-up question is, there was another student who wanted to know what you might say to somebody who is struggling with issues of body positivity.
That's really tricky because our parents, they speak a different language than us. You know, we can't use our language and our perspective and impose it upon our parents, you know. But just the fact that you want to tell your mom she's beautiful is pretty darn brilliant right there, you know. And sometimes you can shift that not on physical beauty, but like, mom, you're beautiful because you cook out of love, you know, or I love the way you walk, you know, or I love the way you sing to me. You can shift that beauty to something that's not physical, you know. And body positivity is really hard to achieve when we're bombarded with social media, all of these things that are steering us into, you know, it is capitalism. Think about it. The plastic surgery, you know, and cosmetic product industry, they profit off of making money from you. So they're not going to want you to think you're beautiful, you know. So that's something to think about too, is who's advertising to you, and they want to make money off of you. So if you think about it that way, then you start to acknowledge that, well, you know, my body's not for sale. Like, this is who I am and I'm going to embrace it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think something that your work does in a really subtle but effective way is pointing to the different economies around objects, whether it's for, you know, the example, I guess, around donut shops is a great one. And the way that it's like a literal monetary economy that, you know, people raise families from. But then the sort of counterpoint to thinking about something like an industry like plastic surgery. So maybe I'll ask this question, which feels related to that. So this student asks, about donut shops. So as a person of Cambodian descent, it was a surprise to know that 19% of donut shops in California are operated by Cambodian immigrants and Cambodians. One thing that caught my attention when browsing through the Khmerkin project was the graphite artwork of Mr. Rogers that you did. I'm assuming, and maybe this is a question that you referenced really quickly in the talk, I'm assuming the facial features were modified to resemble that of a Cambodian. If that was the case, what were the circumstances that led to the decision? And I think you spoke about that really briefly and said it was sort of a mistake, but I'm also curious to know, what does it feel like, or what for you as the artist and the kind of creator of that work, to have a student with a kind of shared cultural background make that kind of observation of that drawing, Phung?
Oh my God, I love it. And that's the thing, as an artist, you kind of have to let go of control of how your work can be perceived, because what's more interesting is like the multiple different kinds of interpretations. And I love that so much. Like, oh my God, he does look kind of kawaii, huh? You know, but that's kind of part of like, a lot of us, for those of you who make art, especially of people, a bit of yourself is in that. So if I had all of you draw Mr. Rogers, all of you Mr. Rogers would look very different. So, but I love that question, and that was unintentional, but I love, hey, why not? You know, why not have Mr. Roger look kind of kawaii? But that was not intentional.
Yeah.
Glad you saw it that way.
We just have a question that came in the chat from Michelle Natividad, who says, "Hi Phung, I'm Filipino American and I make art about my transition from my childhood to the Philippines to the American South in North Carolina. It was hard to navigate this duality. When I moved to California, I loved the beach and became so brown that my mother refused to attend my high school graduation, which was traumatic." I'm sorry to hear that, Michelle. I'm now making work about my experiences and my culture through furniture and household items. I'm now experiencing having to dumb down my culture so my art is more palatable and understandable to a white audience. How do you circumvent that? Is it okay to make work that may seem esoteric to others yet resonates with your own people?
That is amazing. Thank you, Michelle, so much. And for sharing, you know, that's not easy, right? To go through that experience. So I appreciate you sharing that. And it's complicated. Families are very complicated, and sometimes they can be really insensitive, right? But also this trauma is kind of passed down. So whatever your mom did, it probably happened to her, right? And so, not to excuse that behavior, but I think it helps us understand that behavior even more. And to answer your question, I'm all for, girl, do whatever you need to do, okay? And it took me I don't want you waiting 20 years like I did, you know? Yeah, I had to deal with that when I first made work with whenever I made paintings with white bodies, no one ever questioned that. But as soon as I started making work with Asian bodies, like, oh, what is this? That happened to me in grad school, you know? Oh, why are you making this, Phung? Do I have to be Asian to understand it? Because I don't get it. You know what I mean? So you just have to be authentic and true to who you are and continue your work. And I think as an artist, you're not going to make work for everybody. It's not a universal audience. You're not going to, and I know that about myself. My work isn't for everybody. And it took me a while, but you know what? I'm okay with that. I rather connect with those few people who really resonate with my work. And for me, yeah, you know, a lot of the work that deals with Asian bodies, I'm happy when, you know, I have Black folks and brown folks, like, I get that too, you know, with straightening my hair, or like colorism, when you see in like telenovelas, there's always like green-eyed light people, you know, and I'm like, yeah, you know, you're going to have that moment too, Michelle. You know, you're going to have that moment where you're like, yeah, I'm going to do it. And there's going to be people like me who get it. And there's going to be people who don't look like you who get it. And you just have to keep going. Don't worry about it. It's going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Michelle. It's an excellent question. So I think, Phung, you've spoken quite a bit so far about the studio practice, but one of the students I think has a really great question that reads, I really enjoy your public works of art, specifically the commission for the El Monte Station Metro. How did your creative process differ when creating a work of art for public space? How does it differ from creating work for a gallery setting? Or is there a difference?
That's a very good question. And for a gallery setting, you know the work is going to be sold, right? So there's that element of consumerism. Where you're making public art, like again, I mentioned, I love it because it's for everybody, you know? And some people say, well, it's going to get tagged. Aren't you worried about that? I'm like, well, then that's what happens. Then the work evolves with the community. If it gets tagged, then it's part of the artwork. It's like scars. They're beautiful, right? With public art, you do have to work with the neighborhood and the constituency. It's about serving the community. Public art is a service. You're serving the community. So when I do public art, I surveil and try to understand the demographic, I research, but also I have people, specific people, project managers or people people who live in the area, community stakeholders, in which I have to show drawings and manipulate them. And I know for some artists, it may not be your thing. Like you're like, well, it's my art, I don't want to change it. But if you really care about public art in your community, it's not a big deal. You know what I mean? So for me, I love that. And community saying, oh my God, I read that as something else. You know, you don't know. And it's really an interesting dynamic to have people interpret it a certain way and have input. Like I enjoy that so much about public art. Yeah.
Yeah, those other, like the introduction of those other voices, I think is so makes it such like a living kind of way to work sometimes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I want to be able to answer everybody's questions. And I don't know we have enough time, but you're more than welcome to email me and answer them. But I want to get to know you. Like, this is not fair, you know, like I want to see these drawings, you know, I want to see, you know, what you did too. So I don't know if we have time, but I would love, love, love to hear from you all, you know.
Yeah. So the students' assignments are due next Tuesday. So everybody in Art 104 who is here, if you would like to share your reflection or any of the illustrations or any of the work that come up when you do your reflection, please let me know. And I will forward all of that to Phung. Yeah. There's another, I think, great question around your path, your career path. And I think you spoke about this a little bit, but there was actually we are actually doing really great. We've hit a lot of the questions / you answered many of them in the talk. And so that's really excellent. Great. This says, this is a long question, but sort of similar to your story. My mother didn't go to college and had to work throughout middle and high school in order to help provide for her family and keep them afloat. But she had always had this dream that I would become an incredibly successful doctor or lawyer to show her immigrant parents how far they've come. Now that I'm an art major, I feel like her view of me has been skewed. Since you have accomplished so much in the arts, has your family realized that this is your true passion? Were you able to remain supported by them throughout your journey of being an artist? And I think paired with that, another student asks, as somebody who has these advanced degrees, how important, how impactful was that formal education, if at all? And what was the kind of impact of that on your artistic style? So I think it's a question around formal schooling versus the world as a school.
Yeah, I shouldn't be saying this because I know you're paying tuition and stuff. You learn all this stuff to throw it out the window. No. But you know, my parents too, just after 7th grade, it's, you know how it is, right? Like our parents want better for us. They want us to achieve that. And I feel that it's also not fair for you to carry your dream and your parents' dream, right? And like also it's easy for me to say that, but it's hard because, you know, when I would be around, my white American friends are like, why can't you just sit down and talk to your parents? Like, that doesn't happen in my house, right? It's very complicated. You have this deep respect and sensitivity for your parents' journey, and you're trying to navigate your own, but your own and your parents are very entangled, right? And I'm not telling you to untangle it. You can still keep that connection. But you can also, your parents are proud of you. They're not going to say it, right? You know how it is. They're not going to say it to you. They're not going to tell you they love you, but they do it in their own way, like making you your favorite food or whatever, right? So even though you may feel that, being an art major, my parents probably see me differently. They're just trying to understand it. They're just trying to close that cultural and generational gap. And at some point, you have to let certain things go. Like, my parents were so mortified when I told them I wanted to be an artist, mortified, and would tell me things like, what a waste, right? And that hits hard, right? Really, really hard, because you want your parents to be happy, right? And even to this day, they don't say I'm an artist. Oh, she's a professor. They rather say that. So it is really navigating, loving, and understanding where your parents come from, right? But you got to stay true to who you are as well. And at the end of the day, they are going to be proud of you. They're not going to say it, but they will be proud of you. They are proud of you. You're going to college. They're very, very proud of you. And you have to keep moving forward from that.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say thank you so much. We have, I think, less than a minute left together in our class time. I think this was such a vibrant and illuminating talk, and I hope that all of the students who are maybe feeling some anxiety in terms of their position or relationship to elders, I think you offered some really great and inspirational words to them, and I thank you for that. And I want to remind everybody that our next Amplify session will be on November 19th, when the collective Mano Ya, who is a duo of fabricators and paint and 2D really dynamic work, will be sharing their practice with us. So you're all invited back for that. And I thank you so much for sharing time with us and sharing space with us and telling us about your practice.
Gosh, thank you so much for inviting me. And again, I really wish I could see everybody's faces and interact, and just want to wish everyone the best. You've made it this far and it's been really hard, but you got to keep going. And that's my job now, is to really be there for the next generation of artists. So I'm really proud of you all for being here, and thank you.
Thank you, so Phung. It's so beautiful to see you here.
Likewise.
We'll have you back when we can be in person.
Can't wait. Thank you.
Well, good night, everyone. Have a wonderful evening. What a nice way to end.
Thanks, everyone. Hang in there.
Bye-bye.
Bye.